Welcome to the psychology of sales, understanding buyer behavior. Now, this is something I am so passionate about. You'll see on the next slide, I've actually got a master's in psychology. And the psychology in a sales situation, I find, is both really fascinating, but also a really excellent way to build confidence when you're actually selling. Because the more you understand about what's actually going on in a buyer's mind and also in your own mind, the more you can feel confident when you're in those situations. So yeah, just to introduce myself, so I'm Jerry Meldrum. I'm the founder director of Ahead of Sales. Ahead of Sales is a sales training and consultancy business, and we run three main programs. The first one is Core, which is sales training, foundational sales training for generally sales teams. The second one is called Orbit, and that is fractional sales leadership for sales teams that don't have a sales leader. So it's particularly good for owner-managed businesses and the owner or the manager are trying to manage the sales team themselves. And I also run a quantum program, which is an income accelerator for small businesses, solopreneurs, that runs across 6 months. That basically aims to help you build a scalable business that stops you having to trade time for money. But I've been in sales for 25 odd years. I've sold everything from advertising to school dinners, and I've sold all around the world. So in countries like Japan, Kazakhstan, Turkey, India, and all sorts essentially. And I've also got a master's in psychology, and that's why I'm really excited to be chatting to you today. So, what will we cover today? So first of all, we're going to cover off understanding buyer psychology, as is in the name. And that's going to actually be at a biopsychological level. So we're actually going to tap into what's going on in the brain. I don't go into necessarily chemicals, but at least giving you an idea of what's actually happening in the brain as well. Then we'll move into understanding what influences buyer responses. And then I'm going to teach you how, or at least help you understand how to deal with buyer responses that you may encounter. And then as an added benefit, aside of what has been advertised, you're also going to learn 4 questions. I think I actually advertised for 3 questions, but you're going to learn 4 questions that can help you take control in sales situations. So, first of all, the first thing I always like to start off with is that to sell is human. Hopefully you've read this book, but it's by Daniel Pink. I highly recommend it. But if you do have any worries about selling or you feel a bit uncomfortable in that scenario, selling is absolutely human. We sell all the time. We sell every day. If you've got children and you're trying to get them to go to bed, you are selling to your children. If you're trying to persuade your partner to go to a restaurant, you're selling to your partner. We are selling every day. It's a very natural human thing. So changing your mindset around that can really help build your confidence. But the good news is, this is a chap I love called Jeb Blunt. After this, I'll send you his name so you can look up his various books. But he also says that to buy is human as well. People want to buy. And the more we understand that, the easier we can find sales situations. So I always like to start off with that just as a bit of a precursor. But let's move in to the meaty part of the content. So I've got a universal truth for you, which is going to start us off. And that universal truth is that everybody buys with emotion. Everyone buys with emotion. And then they justify that with logic. So what I want you to do is reflect on maybe a purchase that you've made recently. Maybe you've spent a bit too much money and you didn't intend to. And just while we're moving through the next few slides, just dwell on that and think, well, did I buy that on emotion and then persuade myself that it was a good choice? So a good example would be buying maybe a slightly fancier car that you maybe didn't need, or maybe a pair of shoes that were maybe a bit fancier than you intended. But even picking out something in the grocery store, let's say you've picked out own brand beans. You think that's a logical decision because it's cheaper, but actually there's an emotional motivation for that. And the emotional motivation could be simply that, you're thinking about saving for a holiday, and you want to be able to save money for that. Or the emotion could be that you're getting one up on a supermarket because the own brand beans were on the bottom shelf, the Heinz beans were on eye level, and you spotted that the supermarket was trying to manipulate you. There's always an emotional reason for a purchase, and then we try and justify it with logic. I'm not going to go into the logical center in this session because, frankly, there's not enough time. But I probably will do another session about how emotion and logic interacts with each other. So, biopsychology and emotion. So, where does the emotion actually live? And it actually lives in the chimp brain. So, if any of you have read the chimp paradox, essentially what the chimp paradox suggests is that we've got two, maybe even three brains going on in our heads. And the chimp brain is the least evolved brain. And it's centered in your amygdala, and it goes all through your nervous system. And your amygdala is essentially, it's almost like our Neanderthal brain, and it's where all emotion lives. So when you feel love, that's coming from your amygdala, and that's sending out chemical receptors into your body to make you feel all those tingly feelings that you feel when you're in love. And when we're actually selling, we're actually speaking to the chimp brain because we're actually speaking to the emotional center in our bodies. All of emotion is in that chimp brain. And this is the area that we need to target, and we need to manage in order to make a successful sales situation. However, that can be quite tricky because generally in a sales situation, the chimp brain is in two modes. Now, the first mode it is in is usually fight. It's in either fight mode or it could be in flight mode. But basically, we all know that everyone in a sale, I'm sorry, I'm just checking just to see if anyone else is in the waiting room, but it doesn't look like they are. But anyone, when they realize that they're being sold to or potentially being sold to, generally the emotional center kicks in, the chimp brain kicks in, and it enters fight or flight mode. And in order to be able to sell effectively, when somebody is in that fight or flight mode, being activated by their chimp brain, remember all logical thought is gone, purely being guided by emotion. What we need to actually do is calm the chimp. So we really must calm down the chimp. But there is something else at play here that we may not be aware of. So I mentioned at the start that in the chimp paradox, they talk about three brains. And actually, there's another brain in play here that is also trying to calm the chimp. And that is your parietal lobe. Now, the best way to describe your parietal lobe is it's almost like a computer, or it's almost like a storage facility. And what the parietal lobe is actually doing is it's going through all of your past experiences that it can remember. And this is a key point. The parietal lobe doesn't store every memory that you've ever had, but it does store responses that can help to calm the chimp. And what your parietal lobe is doing is it's going through its little bank of everything, trying to calm down the chimp when it's in its fight or flight mode, and trying to pair that response with the scenario that the chimp finds itself in. And so it's pulling out anything it can do from its storage, from its bank, from its computer memory, whatever you want to think of it as. And it's feeding these messages into the chimp to try and calm it down. So the parietal lobe is actively working in the background in a very much unconscious manner to send messages to the chimp brain to try and calm it down. And what this generates for you as a seller or a business owner trying to sell your business is it generates responses like these. I don't take sales calls. Take me off your database. I don't have time right now. I have a supplier already. Now, what these, well, actually, to go into these, what are these? And this is more of a rhetorical question. I'm not looking for an answer on this. But what are these when you think about it? And maybe dwell on that just for a second before I move on to the next phase. So if you just think about how the parietal lobe is pulling out every stored interaction or response it may have given in the past, it's trying to calm down the chimp brain. And what these are actually is conditioned responses. These are conditioned responses that people have used in the past that they have recognized have got potentially an annoying seller off the phone when they were eating their dinner. It's got somebody off their back, or it's allowed them to get out of a sales scenario that they've been in that potentially they've decided that they don't want to be in before. They're all conditioned responses and they're coming from the parietal lobe. And what that means is actually they're white lies. They're not accurate descriptions of what is going on. And this is where sellers can often fall down because they take that response as being a true and accurate reflection of what the buyer is thinking. When actually all that is going on is that the buyer is feeling a bit uncomfortable themselves, and they are drawing on a conditioned response, a remembered response that is stored in their parietal lobe, and that's feeding into the chimp brain to try and calm it down from its fight or flight mode. So there'll be loads of time at the end to ask questions on this. So I'm going to move on. So what do we do? What do we do in this scenario when the chimp brain is basically bouncing around, it's screaming, it just wants to get out of that scenario, it's completely having an emotional response, and it's drawn on the parietal lobe to actually give it a response that it can use. And what we actually do in that scenario, probably before we even try and do anything insightful or anything like that, is we actually try and disrupt. We're trying to disrupt the conditioned response that's coming from a fight or flight response in the chimp brain. Now, this sounds a bit aggressive, I guess, or argumentative, but actually it's very, very easy to disrupt. And how we disrupt is that we actually ask questions. Now, some questions can be slightly more pointed. Some questions can be maybe slightly more empathetic. But the main point is that we're asking questions to try and disrupt what is a preconditioned fight or flight response, which often represents a white lie that the person is telling you. So let's move on to the meat of the stuff that I think will be really, really useful for you. So 4 questions that you can use to disrupt conditional responses. I got confused there because I seem to have a duplicate slide, so that's why I got a little bit confused. So I'm going to move swiftly on to the first question. And the first question is, out of interest, what do you mean by a sales call? Now, this is a great question. It's not for everyone. It can seem like quite a pointed question, and you have to say it with a certain amount of cheek and charm. But it's perfect. It's very, very useful in certain scenarios. So, for example, it's very, very great if you're doing sales calling. So if you, and I don't necessarily expect everyone on this call to be a hardened cold caller, but it might be that you occasionally partake in a little bit of cold calling. And you get blocked by a gatekeeper, or you get blocked by the person themselves, and they'll say something like, is this a sales call? I don't take sales calls. Is this a cold call? So this is the kind of scenario that you might find yourself in. And if you go, out of interest, what do you mean by a sales call? What that can really do is stump the gatekeeper or stump the buyer. And what it can do is actually open up enough of a gap for you to generate a hook, or ask another question that can generate a bit more interest. And quite often they come back to you and they go, well, I mean, you're trying to push a product or a service, aren't you? And that's when you can jump in with the follow-up, which I'll cover on in a second. But what you can also do, if you ask it in the right way, what do you mean by a sales call? It can help you build curiosity in the person, and that can help to calm the chimp. So the chimp, remember, is drawing on the parietal lobe. It's drawing on a response that it's used in the past that has worked. I don't take sales calls, or I don't take cold calls, or is this a cold call? Those are all preconditioned responses that the buyer and the chimp brain of the buyer is using to try and get you off the phone or out of that interaction quickly. And by asking that question, what do you mean by a sales call? You stop that preconditioned response, you stop that emotional response. And actually, if asked correctly, you can help to build a bit of curiosity to create enough of a gap for you to actually not necessarily pitch, but ask another question. And a question that I would suggest that you ask is, and it's a bit of a closed question to be fair, but you can say, what if this call was about trying to help you solve a problem you've been struggling with? And actually, no, that's an open question. Um, and, it may be that the response you get is still maybe a bit negative. They might still be kind of like, oh, I know all the tricks of the book. But with a lot of buyers, and certainly more than if you hung up at that very stage, is this a sales call? It will be enough for them to go, all right, tell me about it. What problem are you solving? And they might still be a bit reticent, but that doesn't matter. You've got enough of an in to actually start a conversation. And actually, this isn't part of the slides, but remember, when you're having a sales conversation, you're not trying to sell. All you're trying to do is generally open up enough of an opportunity to either have a conversation, make a proposal, have a meeting, something like that. The sale comes further down the process when you've actually done everything that precurses the sale. Generally, most of us on this call are not trying to close a sale on that first interaction. So therefore, this creates enough of an opportunity for you to open up that conversation, calm down the chimp brain, stop it bouncing around inside the person's head, and actually start to open it up to curiosity and start to open up that emotion to be willing to listen to you. Now, a bit further on in that conversation, remember the person's still going to be a bit, I'm being sold to. And what you have to do is kind of open up the art of the possible, if you like. So a really great question you can do for that, to again further calm the chimp, again further gain curiosity from the chimp, is to say something like, if you could wave a magic wand and fix one aspect, what would it be? And that's a really useful question if they've already got a supplier in place, because they'll use that as another conditioned response. So if they've got a supplier in place, you could say, oh, great, I'm really delighted you've got a supplier. Yeah, I know them really well. They're really, really good. Now, just out of interest, if you could wave a magic wand and fix one aspect of the service you're getting now or in your wider business, what would it be? And the reason this is a good question is it actually invites imagination. Your buyer has to sit back and think. And as soon as they sit back and think, they're engaging their logical brain. And by engaging their logical brain, they practically shut down their chimp brain, which is going mad. But the logical brain is feeding into the chimp brain and helping them generate emotion, but in a far more positive way. What it also does is it gets the buyer to tell you their challenge in a positive way, because we're actually talking about solutions. We're actually talking about fixing a problem, and actually it reframes what was a fight or flight mechanism into being a positive and exciting interaction, if you like. But the most important thing is it gets the buyer to tell you what it is that they want to fix in their own words. And as soon as a buyer tells you something in their own words, it becomes their truth. And the quickest way to calm down the chimp is to get somebody to tell you an issue in their own words that is their own truth. But also for you as a seller, it helps you to actually identify what's most important and what the issue is. And once you've asked that question and once they've given you a response, what's really nice is you can just follow up with saying, okay, so if I could solve that problem for you, what would that mean personally for you and your business? It's a really nice way to follow that on, having had a positive interaction and having had the chimp gone from being in fight or flight into being excited and positive and thinking about the art of the possible. And it's a really good way to actually link you back into you being the solutions provider for that problem as well. Okay, another question that you can use, and this is really, really useful if somebody kind of says, oh, I don't have the time for this right now, or I really like what you said, but the timing just isn't right. So this is assuming sort of that you've done quite a lot of investigation work beforehand, and you've really got into, what is the nub of the problem. And what you can say is, well, if you don't solve this problem now, what would be the implication for you personally and for your business? Now, you have to remember that the timing isn't right just now is another conditioned response, and buyers throw conditioned responses at you at any stage in the sales process. So this is very much another conditioned response. And why this question is really, really great is, well, of course, it disrupts that conditioned response. But it also can shift a buyer from indecision into urgency, because suddenly they reflect back on everything you've discussed. They reflect back on their issues. And actually, that starts to aggravate the chimp brain. The chimp brain starts to feel a bit uncomfortable. Oh, oh, yeah, actually, I've been having this pain for ages. And just because Sandra's left and we're a man short, or a person short, rather, you know, well, actually, this pain is still going to, in fact, this pain could be even worse because we've got less people. So anything can happen to make a buyer draw on their conditioned responses. Um, it's almost like their comfort zone, if you like, and their comfort zone is calming the chimp. But actually, what you can do is get the chimp to reflect more on the issues that they're having and amplify its fear and its pain and its fight or flight mode in a very different way by using this question that benefits you. It helps you to amplify their pain points. And again, like I've just mentioned, it will generate an emotional pain. But the beauty of this question is you're asking both about personally and also about business. And by incorporating both personal and professional standpoints, the buyer will actually connect on a far deeper and more emotional level. And then you can follow up with that with, well, how would you feel 3 months from now if this is actually solved for you? So it shifts that pain into being a positive. The chimp gets excited again, and then you're far more likely to then be able to close down that conversation and close a sale. And the last question that I'm going to give you is my favorite question of all. And generally, it's used when you're handling objections. Now, there is a bit of a theory in sales that if you've done all of your pre investigation work correctly and you've asked all the questions you need to ask, then you shouldn't get objections. What I'm saying in this is that actually, you probably will get objections, because no matter where you are in the process, the buyer will always have the chimp brain bouncing around in their head. And quite often, an objection you get will be, oh, well, you're too expensive, or something along those lines. They'll throw out an issue. And quite often, that issue is a conditioned response. And a great way to deal with that is saying, let's imagine that I put X in there, but let's imagine that issue is solved. And that X can represent anything. It could be price, it could be not the right time, it could be don't have the right person to implement, or whatever it could be. But generally, it's something conditioned. It's a usual thing that you'll hear. But let's imagine that that issue is solved. Would we be going ahead today? Now, this really puts buyers on the spot. And the reason it's my favorite question is it helps you to isolate what is an often conditioned objection, especially price. Price is the most conditioned objection that you'll ever get. And if you remove price from that equation, actually you can get to the nub, because quite often they'll go, oh, well, actually, this is the issue. And once you know what the real issue is that's going on, you can calm down the chimp again, because you can say, oh, I didn't realize I hadn't explained that correctly. Let me explain that to you again. Or you can challenge them, because if they say, well, actually, this is the real issue, and you can go, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but earlier in our discussions, you said X, Y, and Z. Is that not an issue for you anymore? So no matter what the response is to this question, you're always challenging the conditioned response that may be coming up, and also heightening things that have been said earlier on in the conversation. But first and foremost, what you'll actually do is encourage transparency, but also you take the conversation away from being a sales interaction. Because as soon as you try and close, as soon as you get an objection, what's actually happening is the customer realizes yet again that they're in a sales scenario, and they go, oh, I need to object, I need to object. And what you can actually do is then reframe that conversation into being one about what their intent was in the first place. And depending on what the response is, the follow-up can still be, what would need to happen to remove that barrier altogether? because you can either explain what would remove that barrier altogether, or you can ask the customer to have input. And by asking them to have input, again, they feel that like they've got control, and that chimp brain is calmed down. That chimp brain is placated. So that's a very whirlwind explanation of both a bit of buyer psychology and some questions that you can use to counteract conditioned responses and take control of buyer psychology. But I'm nothing if not one for generating a few action points. Now, I'm going to give some suggested action points, but perhaps if people are going to stay for a bit of a discussion after this session, perhaps you could write down an action point that you're going to take and reiterate that or explain that to the group. But the action points I would suggest is that anytime you're in a sales situation, remember the chimp. You hear this all the time with people that are nervous about giving presentations, and it's like, imagine your audience is actually in their underwear. What I would suggest is imagine you're talking to a chimp, and just imagine how a chimp would react. They might throw bananas at you. In fact, they might throw feces at you for a nicer term for another word. But imagine the chimp. Imagine the chimp bouncing around. It's a primeval. Don't want to insult chimps, but I think that's the right description. It's a primeval being that isn't guided by logic. It's guided purely by emotion. So always remember that chimp. Remember that you're talking to a chimp, and the person you're talking to is being guided with a chimp response, which is usually fight or flight. And what you could do is take one question from this session. I will send the recording of this part of the session out to you afterwards as well. So please don't worry if you've not noted them down. Take one question and use it in your next sales interaction, and focus on how the buyer reacts. Watch how it changes the conversation. Watch the effect it has and reflect on that after the conversation, because that will give you further confidence to use it. Now, I've given you sort of some questions that I've come across in my sales scenario, but everyone is selling different products, different services, and deal with different buyers. So what you could also think about and reflect on is different scenarios that you've had in the past, and actually just think to yourself, well, they said this to me. Was that a conditioned response, do I think, or was that actually a true objection? And from that, you can actually work out your conditioned responses and potentially create your own disruptor questions that you could use to great effect. But the biggest thing you can do is to actually practice. And I don't necessarily mean practice in your next buyer interaction. What I mean is practice. And I tend not to suggest practicing on family and friends. What I tend to suggest is that you actually practice on your peer network. So if you're part of networking groups, maybe speak to a few close confidants that you've got, because if you practice with family and friends, it's always just going to be awkward. And I don't know about you, but if I practice on my other half, he'll generally pick me apart before I've even got to the nub of it, and then it creates a massive argument. So for want of not destroying your home lives, I would actually suggest choosing a sort of peer network or something like that, a close confidant that you respect on a professional level, and actually practice with them and practice your disruptive questions, and ask them to actually role play that scenario with you. So to just summarize what we've covered today, we've covered off how to understand buyer psychology at a biopsychological level. We've begun to delve into how to understand what influences buyer responses. And then we've begun to understand how to deal with those buyer responses. And what I mean by that, and I didn't say at the start, is actually how to deal with those responses when it's really clear that they are just conditioned responses that the buyer has picked up over time by either using them themselves or watching other people use them. And then what we've also done is we've learned 4 questions to take control in sales situations.